Hey there, my name is E.W. Buckley. I'm a composer, music producer, and Ableton certified trainer, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are talking about Shaper MIDI, which is an effect that might have gone under your radar because it's pretty similar to a more popular modulation device called Shaper. But I'm going to point out to you today one tiny but absolutely massive difference between the two that makes Shaper MIDI distinct and so worth including in your productions. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So the device that I want to discuss with you today is Shaper MIDI. Now, Shaper MIDI is very similar to the modulation audio effect Shaper. The main difference here with Shaper MIDI is that instead of being triggered like an LFO at a steady rate, Shaper MIDI is going to be triggered by an incoming MIDI note. But there is one additional feature that Shaper MIDI has that is unique to it compared to Shaper, and that is this randomize button. And what we're going to focus on today is retriggering this, modulating it based off of an incoming MIDI note to create really these, procedural generative modulation shapes. Right now, I have this example beat that I am working with here. So let's start here with this arpeggio. Because Shaper MIDI is triggered by an incoming MIDI note, we have to be thoughtful about the length of that MIDI note. Because that modulation is re-triggered every time a note comes in, having the arpeggiator like this isn't super helpful. So if I jump Shaper MIDI ahead of this arpeggiator, because the notes that are being arpeggiated are just whole note chords, we're going to actually see this whole shape play out. And it gets re-triggered at the start of every new chord. I can map this onto something then. So what I'll go ahead and do is I'm going to set it to a remote range of 0 to 100, and I'm going to map it to the tone of this instrument to start so we can hear this effect. Now, even though Shaper MIDI isn't an arpeggiated effect, it still has this rate value. And that rate value, we can really just think of it as the length of this modulation that we've drawn. And so since each of these chords are a measure long, I'm going to increase the rate until we are at a full measure. So now it will take this full chord to move through this shape. So I'm going to grab another MIDI effect that you may or may not be familiar with, and that MIDI effect is called MIDI envelope, or envelope MIDI to be accurate. So envelope MIDI is similar to Shaper MIDI in that it is triggered based on an incoming MIDI note. However, then you can set an envelope, and you can then just essentially map parameters to operate based off of MIDI. That's really our high-level overview of MIDI envelope here. So I'm going to turn off velocity triggering. I don't need that to trigger this at all. I'm going to bring my sustain all the way down to 0, and then I'm going to set this to a remote value of 0 to 100, and I'm going to map it to this random button. So now every time a new MIDI note triggers envelope MIDI, it in turn triggers this randomized shape. And just to help us visually clean up what's happening, I'm actually going to take all three of these devices and group them together. And then I'm going to create just a separate chain with Shaper MIDI and envelope MIDI. And I'm going to actually turn off the chain activator because I don't need this separate chain sending MIDI down the line. I just need a MIDI note coming into this to then be able to trigger these two effects, because that's going to now clear up a little bit of real estate so that we can see what we're modulating here, which is what I want to focus on, is creating some additional modulations. So Shaper MIDI, like any other modulation device, can actually map up to 8 parameters. So I'm going to map some other things. I'm going to map the string decay, and I'm going to set that range to 25 to 75%. Next, I'm going to go ahead and map this bandpass filter, and I'm going to leave it to modulation, but I'm going to give it plus or minus a value of 25%. The final thing I want to map is the randomize panning. And that I'm also going to set to remote control, and we'll leave it at 0, but max it out at 70. So now this sound is going to be so much more dynamic because every single measure, all these parameters are going to be modulated based off of this shape that also changes every measure. Now, there are some things that you can do to further control this randomization on a more global scale. If the ranges that you set are just too wide or you need to tighten them, you can of course use the depth control. And so let's bring the depth down to 20%, let's say. Now, something then that pairs nicely with this is this offset, which allows you to occupy a more consistent area, particularly when coupled with the depth. We can essentially offset that modulation to force it to more positive values or to force it to more negative values. We can also trigger it still at a faster rate if we wanted to than what we're getting here. And we can use various MIDI effects to help us with that. But one that I think is really useful is note echo, that we can then run before this MIDI envelope. And we can set it to, say, a delay time of 3, and we will leave the feedback to 0%. So now 3/16 notes into this chord, it's going to trigger again, which is going to then result in the envelope changing partway through. And again, then we'll make the overall envelope that much more complex. Let's scroll down a bit so we can see all that. Now let's go ahead and move on to drums. And we'll remember from the top of the video that I said that working with short, fast MIDI notes can be difficult with Shaper MIDI because we just don't have enough time for a shape to play out in a way that we can actually hear what's happening. And nothing is more emblematic of short, fast MIDI notes than drums. So how do we work with Shaper MIDI in this context? And the cool thing is with drum racks, we have empty cells that we can use to program additional behavior. And again, because Shaper MIDI is triggered based off of an incoming MIDI note, we can just place it on its own cell in the drum rack to then map to other parameters. So I'm going to do our similar setup with Shaper MIDI. And again, I'm going to grab the envelope MIDI as well and place that before Shaper MIDI, turning off the velocity, bringing the sustain down to 0, and setting the map to remote to map to random. And now I can just go ahead and rename this pad Shaper. On the MIDI roll, now this pad indicates Shaper, which is awesome because I can now just use this to trigger Shaper. So I'm going to go ahead and set up Shaper to trigger every half note. let's say. So now, as it plays, we're going to watch the shape change every half note. Awesome. So I'm going to also adjust the rate to be a half note as well, so that this shape moves throughout the whole duration of this MIDI note. And let's start mapping it to some stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and map this to this snare stretch feature. I'll crank it up so you can hear it. It's really intense. So I'm going to keep it subtle. Let's go to like 25%. I'm going to also then map this percussion loop feature, which triggers the various percussion loop audio effect to tighten up and to create these really tight loops. So I'm going to go back over here to my shaper, and I'm going to leave this to a plus, and I'll let it go 50%. And so we can hear that too. So we hear that subtle, like looping that almost feels like a sound is being dragged back or syncopated. That's the perc loop. I'm also going to map it to the hi-hats. I'm going to go ahead and set that to remote and a value of 25 to 100 for that. And then I'm also going to map it to this velocity modulation effect, which modulates a whole bunch of parameters on our various drum samplers here based off of the incoming velocity values. So it's modulation on top of modulation, but I'm taking y'all to complex town today, which is okay. We're having a lot of fun. So let me go back to our shaper then, and I'm going to just set that to a value of plus 50. So now every time Shaper MIDI gets triggered, we're going to have all of these parameters swell up in a really interesting, complex, but musical fashion. Now, it sounds really cool, but that is a lot to have happen as frequently as it does. And this is where we can take advantage of a really cool feature of MIDI, which is that we can choose the chance that it will actually trigger. So I'm going to highlight all of these Shaper MIDI notes, and then I'm going to set the chance for every single one of them to 30%. And so now, even though this MIDI note occurs every half measure, there's only a 30% chance it will actually get triggered and then therefore trigger Shaper MIDI and all of this modulation, which we'll be able to see play out here. So this is one where the offset and the depth control that we discussed might even be more pertinent than on a pitched sound, because since we are using our chance probability to say, hey, we're going to add some space in between here, you might notice that then the sound finishes at whatever stage the envelope was at, which means it's not going to nicely return to wherever we have it set by default, which can be really cool depending on how intense of a sound you're creating. And so I tend to like to dial in a tighter depth as a result. So let's set the depth to 50% and let's trigger this again. And so if we pair it back then with the ARP that we've also had these effects on and the sub bass that's anchoring us, we might then just have a 4-bar loop, but this 4-bar loop is really expressive because it is constantly self-modulating in interesting new directions. So as as you can see, while Shaper MIDI shares a similarity with Shaper, it is absolutely its own device and one that is worth knowing. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. I'm working really hard to try to grow this channel to 50,000 subscribers by the end of 2026, and it's your support entirely that makes it possible. If you want to take a step towards sustaining the work that I'm doing on this channel, consider supporting me over on Patreon. I have 2 tiers for you to check out, and at my highest artist tier, you get all of my presets for free, and you get a new one every single month, as well as extra bonuses here and there. And you get every sound that you heard in today's video, in fact. Thank you so much for watching again, and till next time.